Hello, my name is Brad Dietzen. I'm a senior here at Hillsdale College and I'm majoring in politics. And I have the privilege to introduce to you Mr. Elliot Abrams. Elliot Abrams served in the State Department during all 8 years of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Mr. Abrams, who received his BA from Harvard College, a master's degree in international relations from the London School of Economics, and his JD from the Harvard Law School, also held senior foreign policy positions in the administration of President George W. Bush. He also has been a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and served as president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He is a recipient of the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award for his work in the Reagan administration. He has appeared on Meet the Press, Face the Nation, Nightline, and most major television news programs. His articles and book reviews have appeared in Commentary, The Weekly Standard, The National Interest, and National Review. He is the author or editor of several books, including Close Calls, Intervention, Terrorism, Missile Defense, and Just War Today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Elliot Abrams.
Thank you. Brad, thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm just taking my watch off to set it down here because there's no clock. We could be here for hours if I don't watch this. It really is a great pleasure to be here at Hillsdale and to participate in this centenary retrospective on President Reagan. In 1980, I was one of a group of then Democrats who switched party to support Ronald Reagan in that year's election, and who then joined the Reagan administration. And as Brad said, I had the honor of serving all 8 years and getting to work with President Reagan. Now, the topic for tonight is Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War. And I realize that when we talk about the Cold War and even the end of the Cold War, we're talking about a period when just about every student at Hillsdale, and really at any college, was not yet born. The controversy over Reagan's role in the end of the Cold War, how much credit does he get for ending the Cold War and for bringing down the Soviet Union, I realize must seem to some students a little bit like a dispute over how did the Napoleonic Wars end or how did World War I start. I realize that's not true for a large portion of the audience who remembers it very well, as I do, but I think it's important to start back, not just for the students, but for all of us. To start back and ask, what did the world look like before Ronald Reagan became president? That is, you need to understand, we all need to remember what Reagan saw when he decided to run for president in the late 70s and even what he saw in the 60s. What he saw was American decline. Here are just some examples of what he saw. In 1968, North Korea attacked a U.S. Navy ship, the USS Pueblo, in international waters and held the crew of American sailors hostage for 11 months, during which they were frequently beaten and sometimes tortured. 11 months. They were finally returned to the United States after we apologized for this incident. In 1973 came the Middle East War. A coalition of Arab countries attacked Israel. The United States rushed arms to Israel to prevent its defeat. The Soviet Union backed the Arabs and told us to stay out. Such was the state of our alliances in 1973 that in all of NATO, one country, Portugal, was willing to allow us overflight rights so that our planes could get to the Middle East by the shortest, most direct route. All the others stood by, just watched. The US-Russia confrontation, didn't want to side with the United States. In 1975 came the end of the Vietnam War. Not, of course, with a victory, nor with a tie, but with a clear American defeat, the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. In 1975 and 1976, Communist Cuba sent an expeditionary force of 35,000 troops to Africa to help the communist guerrillas in Angola win power there. 1979 was the year before the election, of course, and it was the worst year of all. In March of that year, leftist forces launched a coup against the government of Grenada, tiny island in the Caribbean. They took over. They immediately declared their desire to follow the Cuban model, and they established what they called the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada. They suspended the Constitution. They immediately started building an army, one that had the ability to intervene in neighboring islands with Cuban help. That's March. In July 1979, communist guerrilla forces known as the Sandinistas took over Nicaragua. So, for the first time since 1959, 20 years later, 1979, communists had won control of a country in our neighborhood, but this time it was two countries, and one, Nicaragua, was on the mainland and easily capable of doing what the Sandinistas said they wanted to do, which was to export revolution to Guatemala, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Honduras. Then, in December 1979, began the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, where they ultimately sent 100,000 troops and about 2,000 tanks. Our enemy in the Cold War, the Soviet Union, was on the move. And in the face of all this, the Carter administration seemed paralyzed. President Carter had delivered a famous speech in 1977 where he said, quote, "We are now free of that inordinate fear of communism, which once led us to embrace any dictator who joined us in that fear." Close quote. So, what did that mean? Go back to Nicaragua. When the government of the dictator, and he was a dictator, Anastasio Somoza, was falling, and the Sandinistas, linked to Cuba and the Soviets, looked like they were ready to jump in to fill any vacuum that would be created, President Carter was urged to stop them, do something. Push Somoza out. Establish a decent, centrist government, a moderate government that would replace him and stave off the Sandinistas. President Carter's chief advisor on Latin American affairs said, quote, "I felt that Carter should not overthrow a government. I felt that we were in that business too long and it was time to get out of that business, regardless of what the circumstances were," close quote. Better, in this view, in the Carter view, better to do nothing and see a communist regime established instead of a democratic one. Just don't use American power. We're out of that business. By the way, I should just say, as we see the Soviet rise, not everyone thought the Soviet Union was going to emerge as the dominant power in the world. That was the year 1979 when a famous professor of Asian studies at Harvard wrote a book entitled Japan as Number One. We were not number one. But I skipped over something that happened in November 1979 that was really the worst incident in that awful year. On November 4th, 1979, 52 Americans were seized in Iran by its new revolutionary regime under the Ayatollah Khomeini. They overran our embassy in Tehran and took the staff there hostage. Ultimately, those people were held in captivity for 444 days in Tehran. Ultimately, they were released. When were they released? It is, as the Russians used to say, it is not a coincidence, comrade. They were released on January 20th, 1981, the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president. There was, by the way, during their captivity, an effort to rescue them in April 1980, but it was a disastrous failure. 8 American soldiers died trying to rescue them. No one was rescued, and American prestige sank even lower. So that is what the world looked like at the end of the 1970s and into 1980. American decline was widely believed, and of course, in some places it was welcomed. The great British author Paul Johnson, in his book Modern Times, wrote that on the way to defeat in Vietnam, the United States agreed to 16 bombing pauses and 72 peace initiatives. Paul Johnson wrote that these were, quote, interpreted by friend and foe alike as evidence not of humanity, but of guilt and lack of righteous conviction. Johnson called the scene of American forces running from Saigon, quote, the gravest and most humiliating defeat in American history. And he wrote that this had a real impact on the leadership of the Soviet Union. Soviet leaders believed there was a, quote, deepening general crisis in the United States. In exactly this period, there was a conversation between the man who was Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Zumwalt, and Secretary of State, then Henry Kissinger, where Kissinger said to the Admiral, the United States has, quote, passed its high point like so many other civilizations. Paul Johnson wrote that America's decline in the 1970s seemed even more precipitous in contrast with the apparent solidity and self-confidence of the Soviet regime. In Modern Times, he records that as early as 1971, a decade before really, the Soviet Union had more nuclear missiles than we did. Between 1962 and 1977, 15 years, we built 302 Navy ships, 302, and the Russians built 1,300. And while they were growing in military power, they were also expanding directly or through proxies in the Third World. I've mentioned it, Grenada, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola. But the list is actually longer. Between 1974 and 1980, South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, South Yemen, Mozambique also came under communist domination. That's 10 countries in 6 years. They were really on a roll. It looked, you know what it looked like? It looked like we were losing. It was a reminder of the words of the author Whittaker Chambers. Whittaker Chambers, who in the 1930s and 40s had been a spy for the Soviet Union, till he broke with communism in 1948 and ultimately became a great friend of William F. Buckley and was one of the early authors writing for National Review magazine. But when he left the Communist Party in 1948, he told his wife, Chambers told his wife, quote, I know that I am leaving the winning side for the losing side. By 1980, it looked to many people like we were still the losing side in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Now, I say all of this because I think we need to understand the first thing Ronald Reagan did to end the Cold War. The first thing was to believe and to say that it was a war, it was still continuing, and that the United States had the ability to reverse our fortunes. Dick Allen, Richard Allen, was a longtime advisor to President Reagan. And when Ronald Reagan became president, Dick Allen was named his first national security advisor. And I want to read you two stories Dick Allen tells about who was Ronald Reagan, what did he think. Here's Dick Allen, the first story. It says, in January 1977, I visited Ronald Reagan in Los Angeles. And during our 4-hour conversation, he said many memorable things, but none more significant than this. He said, quote, my idea of American policy toward the Soviet Union is simple, and some would say simplistic. He said, it is this: we win and they lose. And he said to Dick Allen, what do you think of that? And Dick Allen writes, no one had ever heard such words from the lips of a major political figure. Until then, we had only thought in terms of managing and coping with the relationship with the Soviet Union. Second story from Dick Allen. There was an obvious need, he says, for the Governor Reagan, to embark on foreign travel. So following an April 1978 trip to East Asia, Reagan visited Europe, Britain, France, and Germany in November of '78. It was in Berlin at the tail end of this trip that Reagan experienced a powerful firsthand encounter with the face of communism. Approaching the Berlin Wall, his countenance darkened, and he stood before it in silence for several minutes before turning and saying, we have got to find a way to knock this thing down. 9 years later, as president, he would utter those historic words, standing in the same place, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, what we see in those stories was Reagan's faith in America and his, he used the word simple, and I will use it, his simple refusal to accept the idea of American decline. So, with that as background, how did he win the Cold War? I think there are 3 parts to this. He understood that the Soviet military buildup, particularly in nuclear weapons and in the Third World, would have to be countered, and that we'd have to show them they could never possibly defeat us militarily or even keep up with us. That's first. Second, he understood that the Cold War was also an ideological war, and that he would need to attack communism and be a kind of prophet of freedom. He put it this way in his first inaugural address: no weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women. That's second. Third, he believed in America. He did not believe in American decline, and he understood how to communicate that to Americans. So I want to take each of those for just a few minutes. Well, let's take the military side first. In 1980, the U.S. defense budget was $303 billion, 303. In his last year in office, it was $426 billion. It's more than a 1/3 increase. When he came into office as president, the United States Navy had 530 naval vessels. In his 8 years as president, he built 60 more. So under him, first of all, the American military was clearly not under any kind of decline. And that's just the numbers. There's also the technology, which was far superior, of course, to anything the Soviets could even understand. And then there was Star Wars. Some of you will remember Star Wars. This was missile defense, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Mrs. Thatcher later recalled the moment. She said, "Do you remember how much they mocked an old man's obsession with Star Wars? Well, now we know from the mouths of ex-Soviet officials, no less, that the Strategic Defense Initiative was crucial in forcing them to renounce military competition and to end the Cold War," close quote. The fact was that as we built missile defense, it was going to make the huge Soviet investment in missiles obsolete. And keeping up with American technology was just going to bankrupt them. And increasingly, they knew it. The Vatican Secretary of State in those years was Cardinal Casseroli, and he later said, "Ronald Reagan obligated the Soviet Union to increase its military spending to the limits of insupportability." But Reagan knew he needed to do more than just build up the forces. He needed to stop that Soviet expansion in the Third World. So he did. In 1983, the United States invaded Grenada, unseated the leftist government, and set it on a democratic course, and here we are in 2011, and it is still a democracy. In Nicaragua, he backed the so-called Contras, the anti-Sandinista rebels, in a civil war that tied their hands, and by 1990 forced them to hold a free election that they lost. Next door was El Salvador, where it really looked like another communist victory was imminent. When I entered the Reagan administration in 1980, Nicaragua had been lost. Our main concern at that moment was, are we going to lose another domino? Is El Salvador going to go under communist control? So Reagan organized aid for the Salvadoran military and the Christian Democratic Party, stopped the communist rebels, the FMLN, pushed them toward free elections, which they held under fire. 2011, El Salvador remains a democracy to this day. In Angola, he negotiated the departure of the Cuban troops. In Afghanistan, he supplied anti-Soviet rebels with arms, and in the end, the Russians suffered 15,000 killed. They admitted defeat in 1988, and they were out by 1989. And near the heart of the Soviet Empire was Poland. Reagan acted to help the Solidarity movement survive and ultimately prevail. In 1980 and 81, Solidarity was growing, gaining influence, gaining popularity under its leader, Lech Walesa. So the Soviets decided to crush it, and they sent tanks to the borders of Poland. Martial law was declared in December. Tanks rolled in the streets of Warsaw. Reagan began the secret funding of Solidarity, working with the AFL-CIO under George Meany, working with the Vatican under a Polish pope. And Solidarity's voice was not silenced. By 1999, the communists were forced to negotiate with Solidarity. A free election was held. The Communist Party, of course, lost. And in 1990, just about a year after Reagan leaves office, Lech Walesa is elected president of Poland. So Reagan used American power and influence to stop the Soviet juggernaut. He did it carefully with minimal American casualties. Margaret Thatcher once said, quote, "Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot." That's an exaggeration, but it's not a great exaggeration. Reagan used intelligence assets when he could, CIA. He strengthened our broadcasting, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe used that. He used proxy forces like the Nicaraguan Contras whenever possible, rather than American soldiers. But the outcome was clear. In sheer military terms, he turned things around. No one after Reagan could believe the Soviets were going to beat us militarily. No one could believe they were pulling ahead of us. No one could believe they were taking over the Third World. That's first. The second part was of his way of ending the Cold War was his ideological assault on communism. It's hard to explain how extraordinary that was, but recall, President Carter was talking about getting over our inordinate fear of communism. Reagan had a different message. In a speech at Notre Dame in 1981, he said, quote, "The West won't contain communism. It will transcend communism. It will dismiss it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written." Now, that was amazing rhetoric, and he went further. 1983, he spoke to the National Association of Evangelicals. This was a moment when many clergy in the US were backing a thing called the nuclear freeze. That meant we shouldn't build another missile. We shouldn't build another nuclear weapon. Freeze. No matter what the Soviets did, we freeze. Here's what Reagan said to the National Association of Evangelicals at a time when so many in the American clergy were backing the nuclear freeze. He said, "In your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and labeling both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil," close quote. Now, Reagan was attacked. He was mocked for using that phrase, evil empire. In the New York Times, the leading columnist of the day, Anthony Lewis, called Reagan's speech, quote, "simplistic, sectarian, dangerous, outrageous, and primitive," close quote. Reagan, of course, never backed away from those words because it was an evil empire. It's hard to explain how shocking, how remarkable it was to have an American president saying those things. But I think there's a way I can convey it. That's by telling you what Natan Sharansky said. Who was Sharansky? Sharansky is now the head of the Jewish Agency in Israel, but he was born in Russia, and he was jailed by the Soviets for a terrible crime, teaching Hebrew. He was the leader of a group known then as the Refuseniks. These were Russian Jews who were trying to emigrate to Israel, men and women who wanted to move there, and they were refused an exit permit by the Soviet Union. You had to have an exit permit. And many of them were sent to prison in Siberia, as Sharansky was. 9 years. 9 years in Siberia. When President Reagan died, Sharansky was asked, quote, "Were there any particular Reagan moments that you can recall being sources of strength or encouragement to you and your fellow prisoners?" And here was Sharansky's answer. "I have to laugh. People who take freedom for granted, who take Ronald Reagan for granted, always ask such questions. Of course, it was the great, brilliant moment when we learned that Ronald Reagan had proclaimed the Soviet Union an evil empire before the entire world. There was a long list of all the Western leaders who had lined up to condemn the evil Reagan for daring to call the great Soviet Union an evil empire. Right next to the front page story about this dangerous, terrible man who wanted to take back the world back to the dark days of the Cold War. This," Sharansky continues, "this was the moment. It was the brightest, most glorious day. Finally, a spade had been called a spade. President Reagan had from that moment made it impossible for anyone in the West to continue closing their eyes to the real nature of the Soviet Union. It was one of the most important freedom-affirming declarations, and we all," and he means here his fellow prisoners in Siberia, "we all instantly knew it. For us, that was the moment that really marked the end for them and the beginning for us. The lie had been exposed and could never, ever be untold now. This was the end of Lenin's great October Bolshevik Revolution and the beginning of a new revolution, a freedom revolution, Reagan's revolution." Close quote. Reagan understood what his critics did not, that the Soviet Union was based on a great lie, and that the people who lived there could not expose it. It was too dangerous for them, except for a very courageous few. like Sharansky. We had to expose it, not make believe we were blind to the struggle or above it, or too sophisticated to take a moral position. Reagan not only did this in speeches, he did it face to face. When he met Gorbachev in 1985, he said to him, "What you are doing in Afghanistan is burning villages and killing children. It is genocide, and you must stop it." Needless to say, there was no one in the Soviet system who would speak to the General Secretary of the Communist Party that way, but Reagan did it. He did it in speeches, and he did it face to face. I want to tell you a joke that Reagan told. Also face to face. He loved jokes. He knew a million jokes. He used jokes, sometimes just to relax people, but other times to carry a message. He told Gorbachev the following story. The Communist Party in Moscow passes a new law: no speeding by anyone, none, no speeding. Now in Russia then, in all of the very broad boulevards, and this is true, I think it's still true, it was certainly true in the Soviet days, and I saw it myself. The two inner lanes, the middle lanes, were only for the use of limousines for party big shots. So they could speed off to meetings or to their cottages in the countryside. Only they were allowed to use those lanes. So the day after this ordinance is adopted, Reagan says, two Moscow policemen are standing on their beat. And they're standing on their corner, and a big limousine in one of those two lanes zips by. And one of them says, "Whoa, look at that. That guy's speeding. I'm getting on my motorcycle. I'm going to go after him. Give him a ticket." And the second policeman says, "Are you crazy? That's got to be some Communist Party big shot. You're going to get fired if you stop. You get fired. You might get shot. Don't do it." Oh, the first policeman says, no, the party just passed this law, no speeding. By anyone, the party said. I'm going to chase him down and give him a ticket. Now, in that limousine was Mikhail Gorbachev, Reagan says. He'd been at his dacha outside of Moscow when there was an emergency, and he got a phone call that said, "Come back to the Kremlin." So he rushes outside to his limousine and says to his driver, "I'm going to drive. You get in the back seat." As they enter Moscow, the cop pulls up alongside. But 5 minutes later, he returns to that corner where he was standing with his friend, and the second cop says, "Well, did you give the guy a ticket?" "No." "Oh, why?" The second one says, Did you couldn't catch up with him?" "No." The first one says, I caught up with him. So the second one, "Well, so why didn't you give him a ticket?" "Anyway, who was it?" The first one says, "Well, I'll be honest with you, I was afraid to give him a ticket. I got scared. See, I don't know who was in there, but Gorbachev was his chauffeur." Everyone in the room laughed except Gorbachev. So, the second part of Reagan's winning the Cold War, the attack on communism. And the third, his belief in America. He rebuilt our faith in our own country. Vietnam had been a terrible defeat, but the worst part was that so many Americans thought it had been a crime, that we'd been on the wrong side. Reagan would have none of that, not after the boat people in Cambodia and the massacres in Vietnam. He remoralized the Vietnam War looking backwards, and he said, quote, "It is time we recognize that ours was in truth a noble cause." Again, widely attacked, but he didn't care. A few lines from his first inaugural should convey this. "Freedom and the dignity of the individual have been more available and assured here than in any other place on earth. We are not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do." That was the center of his message. Now, I've conveyed the sense that he won the Cold War. You know, there are a lot of people who would say, no, Gorbachev should get the credit for ending the Cold War. In 1990, as it does every 10 years, Time magazine named a man of the decade. Or now it's person of the decade, but in those bad old days it was man of the decade. Who was the man of the decade? Mikhail Gorbachev, not Ronald Reagan. And I think Gorbachev does get some credit. He seems to have understood the jig was up, that there'd be no more Soviet victories in the Third World. Their economy could not possibly compete with ours. He seems to have understood that. We were spending 4% of our gross national product on defense. He was spending 20. So it's a significant thing that he reaches those conclusions. But I'll just read you what a writer at the left of center Slate magazine wrote. At some point, some Kremlin leader would have had to mount a major reassessment. The Soviet system was dysfunctional and its empire was collapsing. The cupboard was bare. Reagan's surging military budgets, without question, brought that internal crisis to a head. So I give some credit to Gorbachev for seeing sooner what another Soviet leader would have seen later. But, as our friend at Slate magazine wrote, if Reagan hadn't been president, if Jimmy Carter or Walter Mondale had defeated him, this is a guy who's a left-wing Democrat writing this, or if Reagan had died, or if George H.W. Bush had taken his place then, Gorbachev would almost certainly not have received the push or reinforcement that he needed. It's an interesting thing. Reagan, go back to that word reinforcement, the reinforcement Gorbachev needed to begin to make those changes. Because Reagan wasn't looking for Soviet surrender. He wasn't trying to demolish them. The Soviet foreign minister said that behind Reagan's program, quote, lies the clear calculation the USSR will exhaust its material resources and be forced to surrender. But he wasn't looking. Reagan wasn't looking for surrender. He was looking, remember that quote from Notre Dame, to transcend the Cold War and the USSR and move on to something better. Move on, above all, to peace. In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet dictator, said, "We will bury you." But Reagan wasn't trying to bury the Soviets. He was trying to free them from the oppressive communist system and turn the Soviet Union into something better. So Gorbachev found himself negotiating not with a vicious enemy, but with a hopeful man who thought a better world could be built. And this, too, was one of Reagan's great contributions to ending the Cold War. Now, Reagan understood all of this. Just after Reagan left the White House, Gorbachev came to the United States. He was a great celebrity. He was given feasts and dinners and receptions all over the place, especially on the left, but pretty much all over the place, because he was given credit for ending the Cold War. Sole credit, he did it. For Reagan, that was just fine. Soon after leaving office, a conservative friend said to him, "All that credit to Gorbachev, isn't that a little unfair?" And Reagan replied, "I don't resent his popularity. Good Lord, I once co-starred with Errol Flynn." Reagan, I would say, was the author of the end of the Cold War. He probably would have said he was the screenwriter, and he was the star. He came to office with a vision. He lived, thank God, to see that vision achieved. I want to commend Hillsdale for doing this centenary, because all this should be remembered and studied and celebrated. There is such a thing as a great man. There are such things as great ideas. Love of country and dedication to it and to its ideals should always be celebrated. I had the pleasure and the honor last week of meeting with former President George W. Bush in Washington. And someone at the meeting thanked him for his service to our country. And Bush replied, "No, I don't deserve thanks. No one needs thanks for serving the country he loves." I'm sure President Reagan would have given the same answer, but I don't agree with it. At this centenary, you remember Ronald Reagan, and as Americans, we can all give our thanks for the services he performed for our country. He loved America, and he served it always with good cheer. So let's use this occasion to recall the ideals he cherished and the good cheer with which he worked, and keep them in our minds as models for all of us to follow. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we have time for a Q&A period, and I think we're supposed to give preference to students, so let's see some hands.
For those of us who were born months and years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and who perhaps don't have the same understanding of fear that pervaded the country, could you please describe for us the tensest or scariest moment in the Reagan administration?
Well, in some way, the tensest and worst and most horrible moment was the day President Reagan was shot. Because, here you have this man who's now knocked out a president, become president. We're in his first year in office. Things are just getting started. There are a lot of offices that haven't even been filled yet. And then this horrifying thing comes across the wires. The president's been shot. And as you know, it was a very serious wound. And there was some time when it was really not clear he was going to survive. Although if you read about that day, the amazing thing, and I think the thing that won him the hearts of Americans who had not voted for him, was, again, this amazing courage and good cheer. For those of you who are too young to remember this, as he was wheeled into the operating room, he looked up from the gurney and said to the doctors, "I hope you people are all Republicans." This is a man who's just been shot. It's just fantastic. I would say, in addition to that, the Marine barracks. The day that all those Americans were killed was just an absolutely horrifying day. Beirut, Lebanon. In many ways, I would say those were probably the two worst days.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abrams. You managed to give an hour talk without saying what your role or what you added to the Reagan administration, and I believe it says here you were the Assistant Secretary of State. Could you talk a little bit about how you helped with bringing down of the Soviet Union?
Sure. Actually, I only talked for about 35 minutes. I had a whole hour and I got into it. Well, I actually had, in the first year, I was Assistant Secretary handling UN affairs. And I didn't like that job a lot, so I switched. And for the next 3 years, this is the first term, was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, which was promotion of human rights. That was a very fun job. And there was a view on the American left that President Carter believed in human rights. President Reagan, what conservatives are like, they don't believe in human rights. So it was great fun to kind of draft up a series of documents about Reagan human rights policy. And in fact, what President Reagan did in those years is just extraordinary, because if you start in 1980, all of Latin America is military dictators, with the only exception then Costa Rica and Venezuela. Everybody else. And all around the world, lots of dictators. And by the time Reagan left office, most of the generals were gone in Latin America. The others were on their way out. They were almost gone. Democracy was coming to Taiwan and the Philippines and South Korea. And he did it by saying to them, basically, you have served a great role in stopping communism. And now you need to step aside, because now you're becoming the problem. And he did it with Ferdinand Marcos. He got him to walk away from the Philippines. He did it time after time. The second term, I was Assistant Secretary for Latin America, which is Central America and South America. And those were the days of in South America, of getting rid of the generals, which was very a wonderful task. In Central America, we had war, basically. We had the war in Nicaragua, above all, and to a lesser extent in Honduras and El Salvador. And a lot of my time was spent working with the Nicaraguan Contras, trying to beat the Sandinistas. And ultimately, they were forced into an election, which happened the year after we left office. And it was the greatest fun of all, actually, was when there would be a foreign visitor, a president from one of the Latin American countries, because they'd come see the president. So then I would go in and do what we called a pre-brief of the president, getting ready for this visit, and then we'd do the visit, and then we would do a meeting after the visit to figure out what had happened. I guess I should tell you one story about that. While I was doing that with President Reagan and President so-and-so, the wives would also meet. Nancy Reagan would give a tea. In those days, there were no women presidents in Latin America. So Nancy Reagan would give a tea for the wife of President so-and-so. And who would attend it? My wife, the wife of the president, obviously, Nancy Reagan, and the wife of the U.S. ambassador to that country. And my wife told me this story at one of those meetings when the tea took place. This foreign president's wife left. And it was time for my wife and the ambassador's wife and Secretary Shultz's wife to take their leave of Mrs. Reagan. The ambassador's wife this ambassador had worked for 4 years in the previous administration, been appointed by the previous president. And as they took their leave, this ambassador's wife said, "Bye, Mrs. Carter." And Secretary Shultz's wife turned to my wife and said, "It's the end of his career." It wasn't, because Reagan was fair. It was a great story, though. Oh, yes.
Thanks again for your speech. I'd like to know if you could speak about China, modern-day China, and whether you think that they represent a similar threat today to what the USSR did in the mid-'80s.
It's a very interesting and difficult question. It's not the same threat, in my view. The Cold War was really a struggle for world domination, and it brought us to the edge of nuclear war several times, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis being the worst. And we fought the Soviet Union. I mean, we lost 50,000 men, very roughly, in Korea, and another 50,000 in Vietnam. So the price of the Cold War was enormous. We don't have that kind of war with China. We have a rivalry with China. I tend to be reasonably optimistic about it because I just don't believe that communism will survive in that country. They're beginning to move away from a command economy to a free economy. I think that I think we see already Chinese more and more demanding their rights. If you look at things like strikes or little rebellions in towns or villages against the local mayor or local party boss, there are hundreds of thousands of these already every year. I think that's going to increase. So I also don't see the Chinese as being as great an economic threat to us, because I think their system is not going to make it, and their demography is awful. Remember, they had for about 15 years this so-called one-child policy, which held down the number of babies and particularly the number of female babies. So now what you have is a population that's aging fast, much, much faster than the US. And you have this historically anomalous imbalance between men and women, which is going to be devastating to that society as it would be to any. So I think they're a very serious rival, but I have faith in us.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. You were mentioning the American decline happening in the 70s, and I'm wondering if you think we are currently experiencing a similar sort of decline based on the Obama administration's policy and behavior with foreign heads of state, and if so, what should the response to that be of, if we win the White House in 2012 or, in the future, what should that president's response be?
Well, at one level, I have an easy answer to that question because I'm a Republican. So, the answer is to get a new president. I think leadership counts for a lot. I think that if you have a president, President Carter, let's say, who actually thinks that we're in the middle of an American decline, and that's fine. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Because as we go around the world, we just make trouble anyway. We intervene. That's a formula for decline, and it kind of demoralizes the American people. I think we're seeing some of that now. I think you have to have leadership that fights that. Now, look, we have very serious problems. Obviously, we have a huge fiscal problem in Washington. But it is not a problem that is insoluble. I really think and obviously there are plenty of Republicans to be blamed here too, but I really think there is a leadership problem. President Nixon was impeached. He is followed by Gerald Ford, who is defeated after a couple of years in office. He is followed by Jimmy Carter, who is defeated after his 4 years in office. And if you go back to the kind of conventional wisdom of the day, Time, Newsweek, what were they writing? Our system doesn't work. No one is fit to be president. The presidency is larger than any individual. And what turned out, we just had the wrong guys. And when we got the right guy, Ronald Reagan, all of a sudden, the system works. So I think leadership is absolutely critical here if we're going to deal with the real problems we have. Want to hold on for the mic.
Thank you again for speaking. You said at the beginning of your speech that you were one of the many Americans who switched from being a Democrat to Republican to vote for Reagan. Would you explain what it was that Reagan said or did that caused you to change your opinion and what the specific issues were?
It actually wasn't Reagan as much as it was Carter. And there's actually a story here it's worth telling. In 1976, he's elected. I was working for Senator Henry M. Jackson, Scoop Jackson of Washington, a kind of conservative Democrat. Carter gets elected and does what a lot of us, I was in a group with Admiral Zumwalt, Gene Kirkpatrick, people like that, and we were obviously drifting away, and Walter Mondale, who was vice president, wanted to keep all of us in the Democratic Party. So in 1980, this would be about May, June, he said, all of you should come in and meet with President Carter, and this would reaffirm your loyalty to the Democratic Party. So we all went in to see the president. And Mondale met with us first in the cabinet room. There were about a dozen of us. And he gave a terrific pitch. And all of us were sort of thinking, well, I don't know, we've been Democrats. And then the president came in the room. And we had agreed that one of us would be the spokesman, and he said, Mr. President, you do us a great honor to meet with us. We want to support you. And remember, this is Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979. And he said, we want to support you. And while it's true that we were very critical of your foreign policy, Since the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we do think the policy has changed and toughened up, and we're hopeful that boom, President Carter interrupted him and said, I don't have two foreign policies. I have the same foreign policy I had from the beginning. So that was the end of our speeches. And the President stayed about 15 minutes, which was probably long enough to tell him what he needed to know about us and vice versa. And as we all left that meeting, every one of us shook our heads and said to the others, Reagan. That was the moment that did it.
Thank you for the speech. I am a former Republican due to disillusionment. During the Reagan years, as a kid, I went door to door for Ronald Reagan in a blue-collar neighborhood. I just about got killed by all the Democrats there. But the big disappointment of the Reagan years I'd like you to comment on, big disappointment for me, were the three appointments that he made to the Supreme Court. Only Scalia stands as a fine choice. It seems that the O'Connor appointment was squandered, and it seemed that the Bork appointment was fantastic, but the great communicator failed to make the case to the American people and to get him on the court. So I think 2 out of 3 liberals is a bad record, and Democrats don't make that mistake. There's not one hard conservative on the court that the Democrats didn't know was a conservative till he got there. So if you could comment on that.
Well, first, I think your facts are right. That is that Democrats have a better record of always appointing a liberal than Republicans do of always appointing a conservative. And there are other examples. President Ford appointed John Paul Stevens. President George H.W. Bush appointed David Souter. So this happens repeatedly. And one of the reasons why has got to be the desire to get an appointment through what was in those days a Democratic Senate. So you choose someone who appears to be moderate. I think that's a mistake, but I think that's one of the things that goes into the minds of the political guys in an administration. In the case of Souter and the first President Bush, he was sold a bill of goods, I think, frankly, by his chief of staff, John Sununu, who was from New Hampshire, and said, you'll like him, he's a conservative guy. That was just wrong. With Bork, the tragedy is he appointed Scalia, as I recall, and then Bork. And if it had been Bork and then Scalia, the president was stronger earlier on. And I think he would have gotten the Bork appointment. He would have been a brilliant justice. But it may have been, I mean, it looks as if it was impossible then. Once the Democrats, frankly led by Senator Kennedy, made a decision to just go all out to smear Judge Bork. President Bush made this mistake, or may have made this mistake too. He certainly didn't in the people who got on the court. He may have made the mistake with Harriet Miers. We'll never know because she had no judicial record, whereas John Roberts and Samuel Alito both had records that, from the Bush point of view, you could look at and say, I know exactly the kind of judge he is. But there's a real lesson here, and it's the lesson you're pointing to. If you believe in strict construction, as all of the current Republican candidates say they do, you cannot take a chance on this. This is a lifetime appointment. You've got to have, I would say, a judge, my own opinion, you've got to have somebody who's been a judge so that there's a real track record as a judge, or you run the risk that you're going to get what, unfortunately, President Reagan got.
Thank you so much, Mr. Abrams. This will be our final question.
You must be a senior.
I am a senior. I am not a student.
This is a centenary celebration. I would like your comments on how we have seen over the years the assessment of the historians back and forth on the Reagan years. I mean, I know you are totally supportive. I'm totally supportive. What do you see as the academic atmosphere presently about the Reagan years?
It's a lot better than it used to be. This happened with President Eisenhower, too. Most academics, if you go to 1960, were saying that Eisenhower was just a dope. It began about 5 years after that. A professor named Fred Greenstein wrote a book called The Hidden Hand Presidency that said, if you think Eisenhower was a dope, you are a fool, and began the reassessment of Eisenhower's extremely deft presidency. So Reagan had a little bit of that benefit. Now, the academic left, of course, hated him, but it's coming around already, and you begin to see more and more books and articles about him that are the kind of, well, of course, I didn't agree with him, but I didn't like him, but I didn't vote for him, but. There's an acknowledgement now of his fantastic skills as a communicator. There's also, I think, much more of an appreciation of his mind, because the view of many on the left then was, well, he's a great communicator, he was an actor, but there's nothing in there. But now we've seen his diaries, and we know that for decades he was writing down thoughts and analyses and comments about world affairs. Now people begin to appreciate what he was like. I hope ultimately this benefits President Bush too, but I'll leave you with a story. It's hard for academics, I think, to fully appreciate Reagan. They appreciate him a lot more now than they used to. But one of the reasons is because he, like many politicians, had a sense about people that doesn't show up on paper, but that you need to have to be a great leader. Story. The leading industrial countries, in those days the G7, met in Venice for their summit, and it was a good summit. And we had the next one the following year. And as Reagan and Schultz are flying back from Venice, Reagan said to Schultz, well, George, we're next. This turned out to be the Williamsburg Summit in Williamsburg, Virginia. He said, we're next, and we're going to have the best summit of all. And Schultz thought, well, pep talk, right? And he said, yes, sir, Mr. President. And Reagan said, no. George, during this summit, I have been watching the other presidents and prime ministers. And I have been asking myself, when are they pleased and when are they displeased? When do they think they have had a good and useful session, and when do they go away annoyed and frustrated? And the answer, he said to Schultz, the answer is they like the sessions where they get to talk a lot. Not a great shock. No one had ever said this before. And he said, George, you may not like this, but here's how I want you to organize the Williamsburg Summit. I want a lot of sessions of leaders only. I want 7 of us in the room so that we can have a lot of conversation. I do not want sessions where the prime ministers and the finance ministers and the foreign ministers and so forth, chiefs of staff, are in the room. I don't want meetings with 40 people in the room. That is how they organized the Williamsburg Summit, and Reagan was exactly right. And all the other leaders went away from that summit saying, wow, we've never had this good a summit. We've never been able to communicate with each other and discuss the problems we face more openly, more candidly. Reagan figured that out because one of the things that he was doing as president, in addition to thinking about the problems that he had to solve, was looking at the man, or in the case of Margaret Thatcher, the woman, sitting at the other end of the sofa or across the table. Who is this person? What makes this person tick? What do I need to do to get this person to give me what I want for the United States? It's an enormous talent. It's the talent of a great, great politician. And I think it's going to be a while before all of the memoirs are fully digested and academics realize. But we are, I would say, we're halfway there. And the picture of Ronald Reagan that they were giving in 1989 is already really pretty much gone. And I'm grateful for that, and I'm confident that he will be regarded for ending the Cold War and for many other things as one of our greatest presidents. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you. Thank you.